Millionaire tests loyalty of Black Maid. What he discovers changes everything. Questioning her allegiance, he devises a plan to test her. The results upend his assumptions and lead to a re-evaluation of trust and respect within his household. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun filtered through the expansive kitchen windows of Jack Thompson's Californian mansion as he stood in the doorway, watching Rosa Martinez work. His eyes followed her efficient movements as she prepared his breakfast, her hands moving with practiced precision across the marble countertops. Rosa had been his housekeeper for 5 years, and until yesterday, he had never questioned her loyalty. Jack's fingers tightened around his coffee mug as he recalled the conversation he'd overheard. Rosa had been speaking in hushed tones with her friend Maria in the garden, unaware of his presence behind the hedge. "You can't trust them completely," Maria had said. "No matter how nice they seem, they always see us differently." Rosa's response had been non-committal, but she hadn't disagreed. The words ate at Jack's consciousness as he observed Rosa arranging fresh fruit on his plate. She moved with the same care and attention she'd shown since her first day, but now he found himself analyzing every gesture, every expression. When she turned and smiled at him, he wondered if the warmth in her eyes was genuine or just another practiced movement. His mind drifted back to a memory he'd spent years trying to suppress. He was 12, sitting in his private school's courtyard with his best friend, Marcus. They'd been inseparable for 2 years, sharing secrets, playing video games, and planning their future tech empire. That day, Jack had confided in Marcus about his parents' upcoming divorce, swearing him to secrecy. By afternoon, the entire school knew. The betrayal had been swift and absolute. Jack set his coffee down harder than necessary, causing Rosa to glance up from her work. The memory of Marcus's betrayal felt fresh, mixing with his current unease about Rosa. He remembered how Marcus had also seemed perfectly loyal until the moment he wasn't. The pattern felt too familiar. Trust, comfort, betrayal. Moving to his home office, Jack sat behind his mahogany desk, his fingers drumming against its polished surface. Through the security cameras, he could see Rosa moving through her daily routine. She watered his prized orchids with careful attention, adjusted the paintings in the hallway to their exact angles, and sorted his mail with practiced efficiency. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect. The tech magnate in him, the man who'd built his fortune on calculating risks and protecting assets, began to formulate a plan. He needed to know if Rosa was truly trustworthy or if she was just another Marcus waiting to happen. The rational part of his brain argued that comparing a childhood friend to his adult housekeeper was ridiculous, but the wounded part of him couldn't shake the parallel. Jack pulled up Rosa's employee file on his computer. 5 years of impeccable service, glowing references from previous employers, perfect attendance record. On paper, she was flawless. But Marcus had seemed flawless too, until he wasn't. Jack's finger hovered over his keyboard as he considered his options. The decision crystallized in his mind. He needed to test Rosa's loyalty, not just for his peace of mind, but to protect himself from another potential betrayal. He told himself it wasn't about the money. His tech empire could survive any material loss. This was about emotional security, about knowing who he could truly trust in his carefully constructed world. As he formulated his plan, Jack rationalized that he was being prudent, not paranoid. After all, hadn't his success in the tech industry come from questioning everything, from testing every system for vulnerabilities? Rosa wasn't just a housekeeper. She was part of his life's infrastructure, and he needed to be certain of her integrity. Looking out his office window, he watched Rosa tending to the garden beds she'd convinced him to install last spring. Her dedication seemed genuine, but then again, so had Marcus's friendship. Jack straightened his shoulders, decisive. He would design a test, something subtle but revealing. He needed to know if Rosa's loyalty was as real as the flowers she so carefully nurtured. Jack spent a week crafting his plan before making his move. One Tuesday morning, he deliberately left a letter from the local community center on his desk, positioned just so Rosa would notice it while dusting. The letter detailed their urgent need for funding to keep their after-school programs running. He knew Rosa volunteered there on weekends. During breakfast, Jack casually mentioned the letter. "I've been thinking about making a significant donation," he said, watching Rose's reflection in the chrome coffee maker. "Perhaps $500,000 to start. They seem to do good work there." Rose's reaction was immediate but contained. Her hands paused briefly while wiping down the counter, and Jack noticed her shoulders straighten slightly. "The community center?" she asked, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of excitement she couldn't quite hide. "They help many families there." "Tell me more about it," Jack prompted, maintaining his casual tone while scrutinizing every micro-expression that crossed her face. He'd learned this technique during business negotiations. People reveal most when they think you're just making conversation. Rosa turned to face him, and for the first time in years, she pulled out a chair and sat at his breakfast table. The breach in professional protocol surprised him, but he didn't comment. Her eyes had taken on an intensity he rarely saw. "I was 16 when I first came to this country," she began, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "My family had nothing. The community center, places like it, they taught my mother English, helped my father find work. Now they do the same for others." Jack noted how she spoke without embellishment, her words carrying the weight of lived experience. She described teenagers learning computer skills, single mothers receiving job training, elderly immigrants finding community. Her usual reserve melted away as she spoke about the center's impact. "Last month," she continued, "we had a young girl, maybe 14. Her parents worked 3 jobs between them. She was falling behind in school, but couldn't afford tutoring. The center paired her with a volunteer tutor. Now she's bringing home B's instead of D's." The genuine emotion in Rose's voice made Jack uncomfortable. This wasn't the calculated response he'd expected. He'd anticipated either excessive enthusiasm, trying to secure the donation, or professional detachment. Instead, he got something raw and personal. Still, doubt nagged at him. Con artists were masters at selling emotional stories. He'd encountered enough of them in his business dealings to know how convincing they could be. The fact that Rose's story moved him might just prove how good she was at manipulation. "These programs," he probed, "they're properly managed? The money actually reaches the people who need it?" He watched her face carefully as he asked, looking for any sign of calculation. Rose's expression shifted subtly. "You could come see for yourself," she offered. "This Saturday, we're having a community fair. All the programs will be showcasing their work." There was no pressure in her voice, just a simple invitation. Jack found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the implications. "Maybe I will," he said, already thinking about how this could further his investigation. Rosa smiled, that same warm smile he'd started doubting, and stood up to resume her duties. Throughout the rest of the morning, Jack observed Rosa W. with increasing frustration. Every reaction seemed genuine, every emotion authentic. Yet the more convincing she appeared, the more his suspicion grew. Wasn't this exactly how Marcus had been? Perfectly, believably trustworthy until the moment of betrayal? Later, in his office, Jack pulled up the community center's financial records. Everything checked out: efficient operation, minimal overhead, maximum community impact. He even found Rose's name listed as a regular volunteer, dating back years before she started working for him. The evidence supported her story, but somehow that made him more uneasy. As evening approached, Jack watched Rosa leaving through his security cameras. She walked to the bus stop with the same dignity she carried through her workday, even after 8 hours of physical labor. Something in her bearing made him question his own motives for the first time. Was he testing her loyalty? Or was he projecting his own trust issues onto someone who'd done nothing to deserve his suspicion? The following Saturday, Jack parked his Tesla a block away from La Casa Community Center, careful to remain inconspicuous. He watched as Rosa arrived, greeting a group of women gathered near the entrance. From his position, he could observe without being noticed, though he felt increasingly uncomfortable with his surveillance. The women congregated in what appeared to be a weekly ritual. They sat at plastic tables in the center's small courtyard, sharing coffee from paper cups and speaking rapidly in a mix of Spanish and English. Jack moved closer, positioning himself behind a weathered bulletin board plastered with community announcements. "My boss cut my hours again," one woman said, her voice tight with worry. Says business is slow, but I saw him hire his nephew full-time. The others nodded in understanding, and Jack noticed how Rosa reached across to squeeze the woman's hand. Maria, remember when I lost my job at the Henderson house? Rosa asked. 3 months without work, but we got through it together. The center helped with job placement, and everyone here pitched in with meals for my family. Her voice carried authority without losing its warmth. Another woman, older than the rest, spoke up. My grandson needs braces. The dentist wants $4,000. Might as well ask for the moon. She laughed, but the sound held no humor. Jack watched as Rosa pulled out her phone, quickly typing notes. Let me talk to Dr. Martinez. He sometimes offers payment plans for families from the center. And we can look into the dental program at the university clinic. The conversation flowed from problem to solution, from challenge to support. Each woman contributed what she could: information about job openings, tips about affordable childcare, warnings about predatory landlords. Jack found himself taking mental notes, surprised by the sophisticated support network operating just below the surface of his wealthy community. Did you hear about Carmen? One of the younger women asked. Immigration picked her up last week. Her kids are with her sister, but they're terrified. The group fell silent, and Jack noticed how Rosa's shoulders tensed. We'll help where we can, Rosa said firmly. The legal aid clinic opens on Monday. I'll go with Maria to talk to them. Her tone left no room for despair, though Jack could hear the strain beneath her words. As he listened, Jack's perception began to shift. These weren't just domestic workers sharing complaints. This was a survival network, a system of mutual support that filled the gaps his own social class often created. Rosa wasn't just participating. She was helping to coordinate, to problem solve, to maintain hope. The conversation turned to lighter topics: children's achievements, funny stories from work, plans for upcoming holidays. Jack noticed how Rosa's laugh changed in this setting. Fuller, more unreserved than he'd ever heard at his house. She shared stories about her own family. Why? Mentions of siblings and nephews he'd never known existed. One story particularly caught his attention. Rosa described how she'd started a small lending circle among the women, each contributing what they could monthly, taking turns receiving the pool to handle emergencies or investments in their family's futures. The system operated on absolute trust, the kind of trust Jack had been questioning. As the morning wore on, Jack's original mission felt increasingly hollow. He'd come to gather intelligence, to find cracks in Rosa's facade. Instead, he was witnessing something that challenged his entire perspective. These women, Rosa included, weren't plotting against their employers or harboring hidden agendas. They were simply trying to build stable lives in an unstable situation. Yet doubt still nagged at him. Wasn't this exactly what a perfect cover would look like? His business instincts, honed by years of corporate warfare, warned him against accepting things at face value. But as he watched Rosa organize a schedule to help watch the detained woman's children, something in his certainty began to crack. The meeting wound down, the women dispersing to their weekend jobs or family obligations. Jack noticed how each one hugged Rosa goodbye, how she had a final word of encouragement or practical advice for each. She remained behind, organizing papers from their meeting, her face showing a mixture of determination and fatigue he'd never seen in his home. Standing there, hidden behind the bulletin board, Jack realized he was seeing Rosa clearly for the first time. Not as his employee, not as a potential threat, but as a woman navigating a complex web of responsibilities and relationships. The question was, what would he do with this new understanding? The following Tuesday, Jack returned home early from a board meeting to find the scent of vanilla and cinnamon permeating his house. He followed the aroma to the kitchen, where Rosa was carefully placing a homemade cake on a serving plate. She started slightly at his unexpected appearance, but quickly recovered her composure. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the cake. My daughter just got accepted to community college. First in our family. I wanted to share. She trailed off, suddenly uncertain about the appropriateness of her gesture. Jack stood awkwardly in his own kitchen, his planned surveillance momentarily forgotten. The cake sat between them like a peace offering he hadn't asked for and didn't know how to accept. I didn't know you had a daughter, he said, immediately regretting how it emphasized the distance between employer and employee. "Maria," Rosa replied, her face softening. "She's 18. Works part-time at the pharmacy while studying. She began to clean up the baking supplies, her movements efficient as always. But Jack noticed a new energy in her step. Under normal circumstances, Jack would have made a polite excuse and retreated to his office. Instead, he found himself sitting at the kitchen counter while Rosa cut 2 slices of cake. His investigative instincts kicked in. This was an opportunity to observe her in an unguarded moment. "My brother would have loved to see this," Rosa said unexpectedly, her voice catching slightly. "He always said education was the key to everything." She placed a slice of cake in front of Jack. The fork aligned perfectly with the plate's edge. "Would have?" Jack prompted, noting the past tense. Rosa's hands stilled on the counter. "He died 3 years ago, back home in Guatemala." Her voice remained steady, but Jack noticed how her fingers pressed against the granite surface. A robbery gone wrong. He taught high school mathematics. Jack felt his throat tighten. 3 years ago, she would have been working for him then. He tried to remember if she'd taken any time off, if she'd shown any sign of grief. He couldn't recall. "Did you?" he began, then stopped, realizing he had no idea what he'd been about to ask. "Kay, did you mourn him? Did you need time off? Did you cry while polishing my imported furniture?" "I couldn't go to the funeral," Rosa continued, answering his unfinished question. "My papers weren't. It would have been complicated to return." She squared her shoulders, professional mask sliding back into place. "The cake is vanilla. Your favorite, I noticed." Jack stared at the perfectly cut slice before him. How did she know his favorite cake flavor? He couldn't remember ever telling her. Yet looking back, vanilla cake had appeared at every birthday, every company celebration he'd hosted at home. "Tell me about your brother," he found himself saying, surprising them both. Rosa hesitated, then pulled out a phone that had seen better days. She pulled up a photo of a man in his 40s, standing in front of a chalkboard covered in equations. "Carlos," she said. "He's the one who taught me English, actually. Used to say that knowledge crosses all borders." As she spoke about Carlos, Jack began to see glimpses of a life he'd never bothered to imagine. Rosa described growing up in a small town, where her brother would teach extra classes for free to help students pass their exams. How he'd send part of his salary to help pay for Rosa's children's schooling, even after she'd moved to the States. "The day he died," Rosa said, her professional veneer cracking slightly. "I was here, organizing your fundraiser for the tech initiative. 300 people drinking champagne, while my sister-in-law tried to reach me about the shooting." Jack pushed his plate away, appetite gone. He'd hosted that fundraiser, raised millions for bringing technology education to underprivileged areas. He remembered congratulating himself on his philanthropy. Had Rosa served drinks that night, carrying her grief along with the silver tray? "You never said anything," he said, the words feeling inadequate as soon as they left his mouth. Rosa straightened up, efficiency returning to her movements. "It wasn't relevant to my work," she replied simply. She began wrapping the remaining cake, her movements precise and controlled. "Would you like me to leave this out for later?" Jack watched her, really watched her, and wondered how many other stories she carried beneath her capable exterior. How many other things he'd never thought to ask about. The woman he'd been investigating, whose loyalty he'd been testing, suddenly seemed like a stranger. Not because she'd been hiding anything, but because he'd never really looked. "Your daughter," he said finally, "the one starting college. What is she planning to study?" "Computer science," Rosa replied, a hint of pride breaking through her professional demeanor. "She says she wants to build bridges between technology and communities like ours." The irony wasn't lost on Jack. While he'd been plotting to test Rosa's trustworthiness, her daughter had been dreaming of entering his world, of creating connections he'd never bothered to consider. 3 days after the cake incident, Jack found himself unable to sleep, his mind replaying fragments of conversations and observations. At 3 a.m., he wandered into his kitchen for water and found Rosa there, preparing tomorrow's meals. She often came in early, but he'd never crossed paths with her during these pre-dawn hours. "You're up late, Mr. Thompson," she said, continuing to chop vegetables with practiced precision. Jack, he corrected automatically, then added, "We need to talk." The words came out more abruptly than he'd intended, carrying the weight of his sleepless nights. Rosa set down her knife, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to face him fully. She didn't speak, but her posture shifted slightly, preparing, he realized, for what she might have sensed coming for weeks. "I haven't been honest with you," Jack began, gripping his water glass tightly. "The donation to the community center, my sudden interest in your volunteer work, it wasn't entirely genuine." He watched her face carefully, seeing understanding dawn in her eyes. "You were testing me," Rosa stated simply. No accusation in her voice, just quiet recognition. Jack nodded, shame mixing with his need to explain. "I overheard you talking with Maria about trust, about how employers always see you differently. It triggered something in me, something from my past." Rosa remained silent, her stillness prompting him to continue. Jack found himself telling her about Marcus, about the childhood betrayal that had shaped his adult suspicions. As he spoke, he realized how trivial it might sound to someone who had lost a brother to violence, who had missed his funeral due to immigration status. "Trust is complicated," Rosa finally said, her voice carrying years of earned wisdom. "But surveillance isn't trust, Mr. Thompson. It's fear wearing a different mask." Her words hit him with unexpected force. Before he could respond, Rosa continued, sharing her own story for the first time without professional filters. "My first job in this country," she began, "was for a family in San Diego. The wife accused me of stealing her jewelry, called the police without asking me, without checking the safe where she'd left it." Rosa's hands remained steady as she resumed chopping vegetables. "They found the jewelry exactly where she'd put it, but by then, my reputation in that neighborhood was ruined." Jack watched her methodical movements, realizing how each precise action, each perfect arrangement in his house, carried the weight of that history. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Continue working in homes after experiences like that?" Rosa's knife paused. "Because dignity isn't given to us, Mr. Thompson. We carry it ourselves." She met his eyes directly. "Every time someone follows me around their house, every time they count their silverware when they think I'm not looking, every time they speak slowly as if I couldn't possibly understand English, I choose to keep my dignity." The kitchen fell silent except for the soft sound of chopping. Jack absorbed her words, thinking about how his own actions must have looked from her perspective. His test wasn't just about trust. It was part of a larger pattern she'd faced her entire working life. "There was a job interview last year," Rosa continued unexpectedly. A bigger house, better pay. The wife liked me, but the husband..." She shook her head slightly. "He said my accent was too thick, that clients might feel uncomfortable. His wife offered to hire me anyway, said he'd get used to it." "Did you take it?" Jack asked, though he knew the answer. "No," Rosa replied simply. "My accent carries my mother's voice, my brother's lessons, my children's first words. I chose to keep my dignity." She began arranging the chopped vegetables in containers, each movement precise and purposeful. Jack thought about his own tech company, about the diversity initiatives he'd proudly implemented. How many accents have been softened in interviews? How many identities had been carefully measured and hidden to fit corporate expectations? "I've never apologized," he said suddenly, "for doubting you, for the surveillance." Rosa closed the final container, wiping down the counter with familiar efficiency. "Apologies are easy, Mr. Thompson. Understanding is harder." She paused, then added, "Your water is getting warm." Jack looked down at the glass he'd been clutching, seeing his distorted reflection in the surface. When he looked up again, Rosa had already moved on to the next task, her movements carrying the same quiet dignity she'd just described. He realized then that their conversation hadn't ended with her revelation or his apology. Instead, it had opened a door to a more complex understanding, one that would require more than just words to navigate. The community center looked different in daylight, without the cover of Jack's surveillance position. Rosa had invited him to attend their monthly fundraising event, and this time, he'd W. Out through the front door. The building's worn exterior and flickering fluorescent lights contrasted sharply with his corporate environment. "Welcome to our real world," Rosa said, leading him through crowded hallways. Unlike at his house, where she always walked 2 steps behind, here she moved with authority. People greeted her with warm familiarity, some reaching out to touch her arm or share quick words in Spanish. The main hall had been transformed into a makeshift marketplace. Folding tables displayed homemade food, crafts, and informational materials about various community programs. Jack noticed the careful organization behind the apparent chaos. Sign-up sheets, volunteer schedules, and donation tracking systems. Your donation helped fund our new computer lab, Rosa explained, gesturing toward a room where teenagers clustered around dated machines. We're teaching coding basics, resume writing, digital literacy. She paused, then added, things that could help them work in places like your company someday. Jack watched a young girl debugging what appeared to be Python code, her concentration absolute. These computers, he said, noting their aged hardware, they're not exactly current technology. They work, Rosa replied simply. We make things work here. The subtle emphasis on here wasn't lost on him. As they moved through the crowd, Jack began to notice details his previous hidden observation had missed. The way mothers balance babies while taking English classes. How elderly men taught younger ones basic carpentry using donated tools. The complex choreography of a community pooling its resources. Maria, Rosa called out, waving to a young woman who was helping smaller children with math homework. This is my daughter, she told Jack, the one studying computer science. Maria looked up, and Jack saw immediate recognition in her eyes. Not of him as a tech magnate, but as her mother's employer. Her polite smile carried a hint of protective wariness that made him uncomfortable. Your mother tells me you're interested in programming, he said, attempting to bridge the gap. Yes, Maria replied, her voice confident despite her guarded expression. I'm particularly interested in developing applications that could help communities like ours access educational resources. She spoke with the same quiet dignity he'd come to recognize in Rosa. Before Jack could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A group of women rushed to comfort another who had just arrived in tears. Jack heard fragments about immigration authorities and workplace raids. He watched as Rosa immediately moved to join them, her manner shifting from tour guide to community leader. She directed some women to make calls, others to gather resources. The efficiency he'd admired in his household now deployed in crisis management. This happens often, he asked Maria, who had remained beside him. More than you'd think, she answered, her earlier reserve cracking slightly. That's why we need each other. Why places like this matter. She gestured around the room. When a system doesn't work for you, you build your own support system. Jack thought about his corporate networks, his business connections, his political donations. Different systems, different purposes, but essentially the same human need for support and security. The afternoon continued, and Jack found himself increasingly aware of his outsider status. His expensive casual wear, his automatic reach for a non-existent phone assistant, his instinctive problem-solving suggestions that didn't quite fit the reality here. Everything marked him as a visitor from another world. Yet people included him, explained things patiently, shared their food and stories. He noticed how they treated him with the same dignity Rosa had described maintaining for herself. Neither deferential nor resentful, simply accepting his presence while continuing their work. Your world is rather different from what I imagined, he admitted to Rosa as the event wound down. Rosa looked at him steadily. Different doesn't mean less, Mr. Thompson. It just means different. She turned to help stack chairs, leaving him to absorb the subtle correction in her words. As he watched the community working together to clean up, Jack realized that his original mission, testing Rosa's loyalty, had completely missed the point. The strength he'd witnessed wasn't about individual trustworthiness, but about collective resilience. He'd been asking the wrong questions all along. The drive back to his mansion felt longer than usual. Jack's Tesla, normally a source of pride, now seemed like an ostentatious symbol of the disconnect between his world and the one he'd just witnessed. He caught himself calculating the cost of his car in terms of community center computer labs, and the math made him uneasy. Inside his immaculate home, every luxury item suddenly told a different story. The imported marble countertops Rosa polished daily could fund a year of college scholarships. His wine collection could cover emergency medical care for dozens of families. He'd never felt guilty about his wealth before. He'd earned it, after all. But now each possession seemed to carry the weight of opportunity cost. The next morning, he found himself watching Rosa work through new eyes. Her methodical cleaning of his crystal glasses wasn't just about maintaining their shine. It was an act of protecting his investment, preserving value that could support entire families in her community. The realization made him slightly nauseous. During his morning coffee, one of Rosa's friends from the community center, Elena, arrived to help with deep cleaning the windows, a regular monthly task. Jack overheard their conversation as he pretended to read emails on his laptop. "Did you see his face during the crisis meeting?" Elena asked in Spanish, unaware that Jack had studied the language for business deals. "Like he'd walked into another planet." "He's trying to understand," Rosa replied, her tone neutral as she wiped down the windows with practiced strokes. "Understanding isn't enough," Elena countered. "We need allies who do more than understand. That coding program you mentioned, his company probably throws away better computers than we could ever afford." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering the outdated machines at the center. His company did indeed regularly upgrade their equipment, with older models usually sold to recyclers. "He's different than I thought," Rosa said after a pause. "But I'm not sure if that makes things better or more complicated." The words hit Jack hard. He'd been so focused on his own journey of discovery that he hadn't considered how his changing perspective might affect Rosa's position. Was his newfound awareness making her job more difficult? "Just be careful," Elena advised. "Sometimes when rich people discover conscience, they expect us to manage their guilt along with their households." Jack closed his laptop, their words echoing in his mind. He'd been feeling proud of his developing awareness, but wasn't that just another form of privilege? The luxury of having his eyes opened when Rosa and her community had never had the option of closing theirs? Later that day, he attended a board meeting where his tech company's charitable giving was on the agenda. The standard proposals felt hollow now. Large donations to high-profile causes that generated good PR, but didn't address the immediate needs he'd witnessed. "We should revise our community investment strategy," he suggested, earning surprised looks from his board members. "Focus more on direct impact, grassroots organizations." "Those are harder to vet," his CFO pointed out. "Less measurable ROI, more administrative overhead." Jack thought about Rosa's lending circle, operating purely on trust and community ties. "Maybe our metrics need revision too," he said, realizing how corporate his language still sounded. That evening, he found Rosa preparing to leave for the day. She moved through her end-of-day routine with the same efficiency as always, but he noticed something else now, a slight tension in her shoulders, a careful measurement in her interactions with him. "Rosa," he called out as she gathered her things. "Am I making your job more difficult? By being more involved?" She paused, considering her answer with the same care she brought to all her tasks. "Change is always difficult, Mr. Thompson, for everyone involved." Her diplomatic response carried layers of meaning he was only beginning to understand. As she left, Jack stood at his window, watching her walk to the bus stop. He thought about offering her a ride, then realized that might just be another way of imposing his privilege on her carefully maintained independence. His phone buzzed with a message from Maria, Rosa's daughter. She'd sent him her resume, as he'd suggested at the community center. Looking at it now, he recognized that his casual offer of help carried implications he hadn't fully considered. Would hiring her help or complicate Rosa's position? Would it be seen as genuine opportunity or calculated charity? The simple certainties of his previous life, about merit, success, charity, and dignity, were unraveling thread by thread. And somewhere in that unraveling, he had to figure out how to be more than just an enlightened employer without becoming another burden for Rosa to manage. On a Sunday morning, Jack made an impulsive decision to drive to Rosa's neighborhood. He told himself it was to better understand the community, he wanted to help, but part of him knew he was crossing another boundary. He'd gotten her address from employee records, a fact that made him uncomfortable even as he parked his Tesla on the street. The neighborhood was alive in a way his gated community never was. Children played soccer in the street, moving aside periodically for passing cars. Music drifted from open windows, mixing with the sounds of multiple languages. The smell of various cuisines created an invisible map of cultural diversity. He spotted Rosa before she saw him. She was standing on the steps of a small church, surrounded by a group of women. She wore a bright yellow dress instead of her usual work uniform, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. She was laughing, a full, uninhibited sound he'd never heard in his house. "Mr. Thompson?" Rosa's voice cut through his observations. She'd noticed him, and her expression shifted to something more guarded. The women around her fell silent, their postures becoming more alert. He started, realizing he had no reasonable explanation for his presence. "I wanted to see the community garden project you mentioned." The excuse sounded weak even to his ears. Rosa studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We're actually heading there now. Would you like to join us?" Her tone was professional, but he could sense the underlying tension. The garden wasn't what he'd expected. Located behind the church, it was a series of raised beds and container plants, each section carefully labeled and maintained. People of various ages worked together, some harvesting vegetables, others preparing new beds for planting. "We feed 40 families from this garden," Rosa explained, her pride evident. "And we teach children about nutrition, science, responsibility." She pointed to a group of kids measuring soil pH levels under an elderly man's supervision. Jack watched as Rosa moved through the garden, greeting people, checking on plants, solving problems. Here, she was clearly a leader, not just someone who took care of others' properties, but someone who built and maintained her own community projects. "These tomatoes," she said, gesturing to a thriving plant, "are from seeds my grandmother saved in Guatemala. Each plant has a story, a purpose." She touched the leaves gently. "Like people, they need the right conditions to grow." The parallel wasn't lost on him. As they walked through the garden, Jack noticed how people deferred to Rosa's judgment, sought her advice, trusted her decisions. This was a different kind of authority than what he wielded in his corporate world. It was earned through service rather than position. "Maria helped design our irrigation system," Rosa mentioned, pointing to a clever arrangement of recycled materials and timer-controlled drips. She combined traditional farming knowledge with modern technology. "Like you said at the community center, different worlds can work together." Jack felt the weight of her words. He'd been thinking about Maria's resume, sitting in his email inbox. The irrigation system showed exactly the kind of innovative thinking his company claimed to value, but created under constraints he'd never considered. As they continued their tour, a commotion arose near the garden entrance. A group of teenagers had arrived with damaged cardboard boxes of slightly bruised produce, donations from local grocery stores that would otherwise go to waste. Without missing a beat, Rosa organized a sorting system. Vegetables that could be used immediately were distributed to waiting families. Those that needed quick consumption went to the church kitchen for community meals. Even the spoiled items were designated for the compost pile that would feed next season's plants. "Nothing is wasted here," Rosa explained, noticing his attention. "We can't afford waste." The statement carried no judgment, but Jack thought about the food that regularly expired in his own refrigerator. As the morning progressed, Jack found himself pulled into the garden's activities. His expensive casual clothes got dirty as he helped move compost, his corporate efficiency training proving surprisingly useful in organizing distribution systems. "You're good at this," Rosa commented, watching him work, "when you're not trying to be in charge." The observation struck him. In his world, being in charge was second nature, expected, respected, rewarded. Here, leadership looked different. It was collaborative, responsive, grown from the ground up like the plants surrounding them. As the work wound down, Jack noticed Rosa checking her watch. "You have somewhere to be?" he asked. "My other job," she replied simply. "Your house won't clean itself." The reminder of their regular relationship landed heavily. Tomorrow, she would be back in his house, moving quietly through her tasks. But he'd seen her here, in her element, and nothing could unsee that reality. A week after the garden visit, Rosa arrived at work to find Jack waiting in the kitchen. The sight was unusual enough to make her pause. He normally avoided the house during her morning routine. On the counter between them sat Maria's resume, printed and marked with notes. "I've been reviewing your daughter's application," Jack began, watching Rosa's face carefully. "She's qualified, More than qualified, actually. Our entry-level programming position would be perfect for her. Rosa set down her cleaning supplies with deliberate care. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice measured, "why are you telling me this instead of contacting Maria directly?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the complex dynamics between them. Jack shifted uncomfortably. "I wanted to make sure you were comfortable with it. Given our situation," Rosa repeated, and for the first time in their years together, Jack heard an edge of anger in her voice. "And what situation would that be, exactly?" Jack recognized the moment for what it was, a reckoning they'd been moving toward since his first suspicions. "I need to tell you something," he said, squaring his shoulders. "About the donation, about my visits to the community center, about everything." "You were testing me," Rosa interrupted. "I know. I've known since the beginning." Jack stared at her, thrown off balance. "You knew?" "Mr. Thompson, I've worked in homes like yours for 15 years. I know when I'm being watched, tested, evaluated." Rosa met his eyes directly. "What I don't know is why you're telling me now." The practice speech Jack had prepared crumbled. Instead, he found himself telling her everything. About overhearing her conversation with Maria, about his childhood trauma with Marcus, about his subsequent surveillance and investigations. Rosa listened without interruption, her expression unchanging. When he finished, she walked to the window overlooking his manicured garden. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she finally said. "Not the surveillance, not the tests, but the fact that after 5 years of perfect service, you still saw me as someone who needed to prove their trustworthiness." "I was wrong," Jack admitted. "I see that now." "Do you?" Rosa turned back to face him. "Because offering my daughter a job right after confessing this feels less like making amends and more like trying to ease your conscience." The accusation hit home. Jack thought about Elena's words about managing rich people's guilt. "That's not what this is," he protested, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Then what is it?" Rosa pressed. "Because from where I stand, you violated my privacy, manipulated my community involvement, and now you're using my daughter's future as a way to make yourself feel better about it." Jack felt his defensive instincts rise. "Maria is qualified. She deserves this opportunity." "Yes, she does," Rosa agreed. "But she deserves to get it because of her skills, not because her mother cleans your house and you feel guilty about spying on her." The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken power dynamics. Jack looked at Maria's resume on the counter, at his notes highlighting her achievements, her potential. Had he really evaluated her fairly, or was Rosa right about his motivations? "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted finally. "That's because you're still thinking like an employer," Rosa replied. "Still believing you can solve problems by throwing opportunities or money at them. Some things can't be fixed that way, Mr. Thompson. Some trust, once broken, requires more than gestures to rebuild." She picked up her cleaning supplies again, the movement deliberate. "I'll finish my work for today," she said. "But after that, we need to have a serious conversation about whether I can continue working here." The possibility of her resignation hit Jack harder than he'd expected. "Rosa, please." "No," she cut him off firmly. "You've done enough talking. Now you need to listen. Really listen, not just gather information for your next decision." She turned away, beginning her usual routine with mechanical precision. Jack stood in his kitchen, watching her work, understanding for the first time that all his recent insights and growth meant nothing if he couldn't translate them into genuine respect for Rosa's autonomy, including her right to walk away from his attempts at redemption. The tension in Jack's house remained palpable for the next few days. Rosa continued her work with professional precision, but the warmth had gone out of their interactions. He was preparing to make another attempt at conversation when Elena burst through his front door without knocking, something that had never happened before. "Rosa," Elena called out, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and urgency. "Lo conseguiste. You got it." Rosa emerged from the study, duster in hand, her professional demeanor cracking at Elena's enthusiasm. "What are you talking about?" "The Leadership Development Program. The city selected you as the new director of community integration." Elena was practically bouncing. "Full salary, benefits, everything we've been working toward." Jack watched the scene unfold from his position by the stairs, feeling like an intruder in his own home. Rosa stood frozen, the duster still in her hand, as Elena continued explaining about a city initiative to bridge gaps between immigrant communities and local government. "When did you apply for this?" Jack asked, making both women aware of his presence. 3 months ago, Rosa answered, her voice steady. "Before the donation, before the tests, before everything." She set down her cleaning supplies with deliberate care. "I never mentioned it because it wasn't relevant to my work here." The irony of her words struck him. While he'd been testing her loyalty, she'd been quietly building her path to something bigger. While he'd been offering charity, she'd been earning recognition on her own terms. "The program starts next month," Elena added, watching Jack's reaction. "Full-time position." Understanding dawned on Jack's face. "You'll be leaving?" "Yes," Rosa confirmed. "I would have given proper notice, of course." She paused, then added, "Though after our recent conversation, perhaps this timing is better for everyone." Jack felt the ground shifting beneath him again, but differently this time. He'd been so focused on his own journey of understanding, his own attempts at making amends, that he'd missed something fundamental. Rosa had never needed his help to succeed. She'd been building her own path all along. "The community center," he said suddenly. "The volunteer work, the garden project, the support networks. You weren't just helping people. You were building a portfolio." Rosa smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen since their confrontation. "Everything teaches us something, Mr. Thompson. Even cleaning houses taught me about organization, management, diplomacy. Skills that matter in any leadership role." Jack thought about all the times he'd watched her coordinate community efforts, resolve conflicts, manage resources with minimal waste. She'd been demonstrating executive skills all along, just in a context he'd been too blind to recognize as valuable. "What about Maria?" he asked, thinking of the resume still sitting on his desk. "My daughter," Rosa said firmly, "will make her own way, on her own merit. If your company is where she chooses to build her career, it should be because she earned it, not because of any connection to me, positive or negative." The subtle rebuke in her words was clear. Jack nodded, understanding finally that true respect meant stepping back, letting both Rosa and Maria chart their own courses without his well-meaning but ultimately condescending intervention. Elena had been watching this exchange with sharp eyes. "The city program," she said, "they want Rosa to help other communities develop the same kind of support networks we built. To teach what we learned through necessity." "Teaching others to fish," Jack murmured, then caught himself. "Sorry, that sounded patronizing." "No," Rosa corrected him. "That's exactly what it is. But remember, Mr. Thompson, we already knew how to fish. We just needed access to the river." In that moment, Jack understood that his role was never supposed to be that of a savior or even a mentor. The community hadn't needed his guidance. They needed access to resources and opportunities they'd already known how to use. "I'd like to help," he said carefully. "Not as a patron, but as a partner. If you're willing to show me how." Rosa studied him for a long moment. "Partnership," she said finally, "requires equals. Are you ready for that, Mr. Thompson?" "Really ready." It wasn't just a question about donation strategies or community programs. It was about fundamentally reimagining power structures, about seeing value in forms of leadership and success he'd previously overlooked. "I'm ready to learn," he answered honestly. "Not to lead this time, to learn." Rosa nodded, accepting his words for what they were. Not a perfect resolution, but a beginning. She turned to Elena, switching to Spanish, but this time not caring if Jack understood. "Sometimes the best teachers are our own mistakes, and the best lessons come from those he once underestimated." Jack watched as the two women began discussing transition plans, their energy focused on the future rather than the past. He realized that the story he'd thought he was living, about testing loyalty and finding trust, had actually been about something much simpler and more profound. Learning to see people for who they truly were, not who he assumed them to be.